Leech by Cyril Hare. At Christmas time we gladly greet each old familiar face. At Christmas time we hope to meet at the old familiar place. 500 loving greetings dear from you to me, to welcome in the glad new year I look to see. Did you ever hear anything so completely palsied? I wonder who on earth they get to write this stuff. Timothy, do you know anybody called Leech? Hilda Trent had turned the Christmas card over with her carefully manicured fingers as she'd read the idiotic lines aloud. Timothy looked across at her. Leech? Yes, that's what it says. From your old Leech. Must be a friend of yours. The only Leech I knew spelt her name with an A. This one has 2 E's. Yes, the envelope's addressed to you. Who is the old Leech? She flicked the card across the breakfast table, and Timothy stared hard at the rhyme and the scrawled message beneath it. I haven't the least idea. As he spoke, he was taking in, with a sense of cold misery, the fact that the printed message on the card had been neatly altered by hand. The word 5 was in ink. The original poet, no doubt, had been content with 100 loving greetings. Put it on the mantelpiece of the others, said his wife. There's a nice paunchy robin on the outside. Damn it, no! In a sudden access of rage, he tore the card in 2 and flung the pieces into the fire. It was silly of him, he reflected as he travelled up to the city half an hour later, to break out in that way in front of Hilda. But she would put it down to the nervous strain about which she was always pestering him to take medical advice. Not for all the gold in the Bank of England could he have stood the sight of that damnable jingle on his dining-room mantelpiece. The insolence of it, the cool, calculated devilry. All the way to London the train wheels beat out the maddening rhythm. At Christmas time we gladly greet. And he had thought that the last payment had seen the end of it. He had returned from James's funeral triumphant in the certain belief that he had attended the burial of the bloodsucker who called himself Leech. But he was wrong, it seemed. 500 loving greetings, dear. 500! Last year it had been 3, and that had been bad enough. It had meant selling out some holdings at an awkward moment. Now 500, with the market in its present state. How in the name of all that was horrible was he going to raise the money? But he would raise it, of course he would have to. The sickening familiar routine would be gone through again. The cash in treasury notes would be packed in an unobtrusive parcel and left in the cloakroom at Waterloo. Next day he would park his car as usual in the railway yard at his local station, and beneath the windscreen wiper, the old familiar place, would be tucked the cloakroom ticket. When he came down again from work in the evening, the ticket would be gone, and that would be that, till next time. It was the way that Leech preferred it, and he had no option but to comply. The one certain thing that Trent knew about the identity of his blackmailer was that he, or could it be she, was a member of his family. His family! Thank heaven they were no true kindred of his. So far as he knew, he had no blood relation alive. But his family they had been, ever since, when he was tiny, an ailing boy. His father had married the gentle, ineffective Mary Grigson, with her long trail of soft, useless children. And when the influenza epidemic of 1919 carried off John Trent, he had been left to be brought up as one of that clinging, grasping clan. He'd got on in the world, made money, married money, but he'd never got away from the Grigsons. Save for his stepmother, to whom he grudgingly acknowledged that he did owe his start to life, he loathed them all. But his family, they remained, expecting to be treated with brotherly affection, demanding his presence at family reunions, especially at Christmas time. At Christmas time we hope to meet. He put down the paper unread and stared forlornly out of the carriage window. It was at Christmas time, 4 years before, that the whole thing started. At his stepmother's Christmas Eve party. just such a boring family function as the one he would have to attend in a few days' time. There had been some silly games to amuse the children, blind man's buff, musical chairs, and in the course of them his wallet must have slipped from his pocket. He discovered the loss next morning, went round to the house and retrieved it, but when it came into his hands again there was one item missing from its content. Just one, a letter, quite short, but explicit, signed in a name that had about then become fairly notorious in connection with an unsavoury inquiry into certain large-scale dealings in government securities. How could he have been fool enough to keep it a moment longer than was necessary? And it was no good going back on that. For then the messages from Leech had begun. Leech had the letter. Leech considered it his duty to send it to the principal of Trent's firm, who was also Trent's father-in-law. But meanwhile Leech was a trifle short of money, and for a small consideration. So it had begun, and so year in and year out it had gone on. He had been so sure that it was James, that seedy, unsuccessful stock-jobber, with his gambling debts and his inordinate thirst for whisky. He'd seemed the very stuff of blackmailers. But he had got rid of James last February, and here was Leech again, hungrier than ever. Trent shifted uneasily in his seat. Got rid of him was hardly the right way to put it. One must be fair to oneself. He had merely assisted James to get rid of his worthless self. He'd done no more than ask James to dinner at his club, fill him up with whisky, and leave him to drive home on a foggy night with the roads treacherous with frost. There'd been an unfortunate incident on the Kingston bypass. That was the end of James. And incidentally, two perfect strangers who'd happened to be on the road at the same time. Oh, forget it. The point was that the dinner and the whisky had been a dead loss. He would not make the same mistake again. This Christmas Eve he intended to make sure who his persecutor was, and once he knew, there would be no half-measures. The revelation came to him midway through Mrs. John Trent's party, at the very moment, in fact, when the presents were being distributed from the Christmas tree, when the room was bathed in soft radiance of coloured candles, and noisy with the oohs and ahs of excited children, and with the rustle of hastily unfolded paper parcels. It was so simple and so unexpected that he could have laughed aloud. Appropriately enough, it was his own contribution to the party that was responsible. For some time past it had been his unwritten duty, as the prosperous member of the family, to present his stepmother with some delicacy, in helping out the straitened resources of her house, in providing a feast worthy of the occasion. This year his gift had taken the form of 6 bottles of champagne, part of a consignment which he suspected of being corked. That champagne, acting on a head unused to anything stronger than lemonade, was enough to loosen Bessie's tongue for one fatal instant. Bessie, of all people, faded, spinsterish Bessie. Bessie with her woolwork and her charities. Bessie with her large, stupid, appealing eyes and her air of frustration that put you in mind of a bud frosted over just before it could come into flower. And yet, when you came to think of it, it was natural enough. Probably of all the Grigson tribe he disliked her the most, for he felt all the loathing one must naturally feel for a person one has treated badly, and been simple enough to believe that she did not resent it. She was just his own age, and from the moment that he had been introduced into the family, had constituted herself his protector against the unkindness of his elder stepbrother. She had been, in her own revoltingly sentimental phrase, his own special sister. As they grew up, the roles were reversed, and she became his protégée, the admiring spectator of his early struggles. Then it became pretty clear that she and everybody else expected him to marry her. He had considered the idea quite seriously for some time. She was pretty enough in those days, and as the phrase went, worshipped the ground he trod on, and, well, everybody expected it. It would have been so much easier But, fortunately, he'd had the good sense to see in time that he must look elsewhere if he wanted to make his way in the world. His engagement to Hilda had been a blow to Bessie. Her old maidish look and her absorption in good work dated from then. But she'd been sweetly forgiving, to all appearances. And now, as he stood there under the mistletoe with a ridiculous paper cap on his head, he marvelled how he could have been so easily deceived. As though, after all, anyone would have written that Christmas card but a woman. Bessie was smiling at him still, smiling with a confidential air of the mildly tipsy, her upturned, shiny nose glowing pink in the candlelight. She had assumed a slightly puzzled expression, as though trying to recollect what she had just said. Timothy smiled back and raised his glass to her. He was stone-cold sober, and he could remind her of her words when the occasion arose. "My present for you, Timothy, is in the post. You'll get it tomorrow, I expect. I thought you'd like a change from those horrid Christmas cards." And the words had been accompanied with an unmistakable wink. "Uncle Timothy!" One of James's bouncing girls jumped up at him and gave him a smacking kiss. He put her down with a grin and tickled her ribs as he did so, and suddenly felt light-hearted and on good terms with all the world, one woman excepted. He moved away from the mistletoe and strolled around the room, exchanging pleasantries with all the family. He could look them in the face now without a qualm. He clinked glasses with Roger, the prematurely aged, overworked GP. No need to worry now whether his money was going in that direction. He slapped Peter on the back and endured patiently 5 minutes' confidential chat on the difficulties of a motor-car business in these days. To Marjorie, James's widow, looking wan and ever so brave in her made-over black frock, he spoke just the right words of blended sympathy and cheer. He even found in his pockets some half-crowns for his great hulking step-nephews. Then he was standing by his stepmother near the fireplace, whence she presided quietly over the noisy, cheerful scene, beaming gentle good nature from her faded blue eyes. "What a delightful evening," he said, and meant it. "Well, thanks to you, Timothy, in great part. You've always been so good to us." Wonderful what a little doubtful champagne would do. He would have given a lot to see her face if he were to say, "I suppose you're not aware that your youngest daughter, who is just now pulling a cracker with that ugly little boy of Peter's, is blackmailing me, and that I shortly intend to stop her mouth for good." He turned away. What a gang they all were! What a shabby, out-at-elbows gang! Not a decently cut suit or a well-turned-out woman among the lot of them. And he'd imagined that his money had been going to support some of them. Why, they all simply reeked of honest poverty. He could see it now. Bessie explained everything. It was typical of her twisted mind to wring cash from him by threats, and then give it all away to charities. "You have always been so good to us." Yes, come to think of it, his stepmother was worth the whole of the rest of them put together. She must be hard put to it, keeping up father's old house with precious little coming in from those children of hers. Perhaps one day, when his money was really his own again, he might see his way to do something for her. But there was a lot to do before he could indulge in extravagant fancies like that. Hilda was coming across the room towards him. Her elegance made an agreeable contrast to the get-up of the Grigson women. She looked tired and rather bored, which was not unusual for her at parties at this house. "Timothy, can't we get out of here? My head feels like a ton of bricks, and if I'm going to be fit for anything tomorrow morning—" Timothy cut her short. "You go home straight away, darling. I can see that it's high time you were in bed. Now you take the car, I can walk. It's a fine evening. Don't you wait up for me." "You're not coming? I thought you said—" No. I shall have to stay a little longer, see the party through. And there's a little matter of family business. I just want to dispose of that while I have the chance." "Well, if you feel that way, you seem very devoted to your family all of a sudden. You'd better keep an eye on Bessie while you're about it. She's had about as much as she can carry." Hilda was right. Bessie was decidedly merry. Timothy continued to keep an eye on her. Thanks to his attentions, by the end of the evening, when Christmas Day had been seen in and the guests were fumbling for their wraps, she'd reached a stage where she could barely stand. Another glass, thought Timothy from the depths of his experience, and she'll pass right out. "I'll give you a lift home, Bessie," said Roger, looking at her with a professional eye. "We can just squeeze you in." "Nonsense, Roger. I can manage perfectly well. As if I couldn't walk as far as the end of the drive." "I'll look after her," said Timothy heartily. "I'm walking back myself. We can guide each other's wandering footsteps home. Where's your coat, Bessie? You sure you've got all your precious presents?" He prolonged his leave-taking until all the rest had gone, then helped Bessie into her worn fur coat and stepped out of the house, supporting her with an affectionate right arm. It was all going to be too deliciously simple. Bessie lived in the lodge of the old house. She preferred to be independent, and the arrangement suited everyone, especially since James, after one of his reverses on the turf, had brought his family to live with his mother to save expense. It suited Timothy admirably now. Tenderly he escorted her to the end of the drive. Tenderly he assisted her to insert her latch-key in the door. Tenderly he supported her into the little sitting-room that gave out of the hall. Then Bessie considerately saved him an enormous amount of trouble and a possibly unpleasant scene, for as he put her down upon the sofa, she finally succumbed to the champagne, and her eyes closed. Her mouth opened, and she lay like a log where he had placed her. Timothy was genuinely relieved. He was prepared to go to any lengths to rid himself from the menace of blackmail, but if he could lay his hands on the damning letter without physical violence, he would be well satisfied. It would be open to him to take it out on Bessie in other ways later on. He looked quickly round the room. He knew its contents by heart. It had hardly changed at all since the day when Bessie first furnished her own room when she left school. The same old battered desk stood in the corner, where from the earliest days she had kept her treasures. He flung it open, and a flood of bills, receipts, charitable appeals, and yet more charitable appeals came cascading out. One after another he went through the drawers with ever-increasing urgency, but he still failed to find what he sought. Finally he came upon a small inner drawer, which resisted his attempts to open it. He tugged at it in vain, and then seized the poker from the fireplace and burst the flimsy lock by main force. Then he dragged the drawer from its place and settled himself to examine the contents. It was crammed as full as it could be with papers. At the very top was the programme of a May-week ball for his last year at Cambridge. Then there were snapshots, press-cuttings, an account of his own wedding among them, and, for the rest, piles of letters in his handwriting. The wretched woman seemed to have hoarded every scrap he'd ever written to her. As he turned them over, some of the phrases he had used in them floated to his mind. He began to apprehend for the first time what the depth of her resentment must have been when he threw her over. But where the devil did she keep the only letter that mattered? As he straightened himself from the desk, he heard, close behind him, a hideous choking sound. He swung round quickly. Bessie was standing behind him, her face a mask of horror, her mouth wide open in dismay. She drew a long, shuddering breath. In another moment she was going to scream at the top of her voice. Timothy's pent-up fury could be contained no longer. With all his force he drove his fist full into that gaping, foolish face. Bessie went down as though she had been shot, and her head struck the leg of a table with the crack of a dry stick, broken in two. She did not move again. Although it was quiet enough in the room after that, he never heard his stepmother come in. Perhaps it was the sound of his own pulses drumming in his ears that had deafened him. He did not even know how long she had been there. Certainly it was long enough for her to take in everything that had happened, for her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly under control. "You have killed Bessie." It was a calm statement of fact, rather than an accusation. He nodded, speechless. "But you have not found the letter." He shook his head. Didn't you understand what she told you this evening? The letter is in the post. It was her Christmas present to you. Poor, simple, loving Bessie. He stared at her aghast. It was only just now that I found it was missing from my jewel case. I don't know how she found out about it. But love, even a crazy love like hers, gives people a strange insight sometimes. What? Do you mean, you were Leech? Of course. Who else? How otherwise do you think I could have kept this house open and my children out of debt? Not on my income. No, Timothy, don't come any nearer. You're not going to commit 2 murders tonight. I don't think you have the nerve in any case, but to be on the safe side, I've brought the little pistol your father gave me when he came out of the army in 1918. Sit down. He found himself crouching on the sofa, looking helplessly up into her pitiless old face. The body that had been Bessie's lay between them. Bessie's heart was very weak. Roger had been worried about it for some time. If I have a word with him, I dare say he will see his way to issue a death certificate. It will, of course, be a little expensive. Should we say £1,000 this year instead of 500? You would prefer that, Timothy, I dare say, to the alternative. Once more Timothy nodded in silence. Very well. I shall speak to Roger in the morning. After you have returned me Bessie's Christmas present, of course. I shall require that for future use. You can go now, Timothy.